How did humans first get to Hawaii? No, seriously. Think about what it would take to get here, to these tiny specks of land in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean, over 2,300 miles from the closest major landmass. Think of the resources and expertise required, and, more ominously, think of everything that could go wrong on a journey of this ambition and magnitude. Think of what a sacrifice it would be to leave behind your loved ones in pursuit of a highly uncertain, potentially even fatal goal. And then consider that, despite all of this, people made the trip. Centuries ago, brave explorers looked across that unending ocean, and not knowing what lay beyond the horizon, nevertheless still decided to forge into the unknown. And what about our daring journeys to Australia or the Americas? How do we get to them? For that matter, how did we get to be, well, everywhere? You probably know that our species originated in Africa a very long time ago, and that we eventually spread out from there. Taking a look at the map, the journey across Eurasia seems pretty straightforward. Leave Africa and enter the Middle East, head north to reach Europe, or continue to head east to reach India and eventually the rest of Asia. Simple, right? Well, what this map doesn't show you are the extreme forces of nature our predecessors had to contend with. It doesn't show you the dangers they faced along their route, and it doesn't show you the populations of other human species already living in these areas that we came into contact and at times conflict with along the way. And also, this map doesn't really answer how we got to places like here, or here. In case you hadn't noticed, there are gigantic, deadly oceans separating a lot of the land masses we inhabit today from the continent we originated on. Oceans, mind you, that remained deadly and seemingly impassable until only very recently in human history. How is it that humans discovered and settled these remote continents tens of thousands of years before they were eventually rediscovered by the likes of Cook and Columbus? This video aims to answer that question and many more by examining the most important series of events in human prehistory. Events which define not only the obvious where we are today, but also the much more elusive how and what we are today. But first, to understand the story of our greatest ever journey, we need a better map. The general scientific consensus today is that our species, Homo sapiens, first arose in Africa. It's here that humans not too dissimilar from you and I first saw the light of day. Here where we first experienced love. Here where we first waged war. And here where both dreams and worries first kept us up at night. Regardless of where you're from or what you look like, the fire of your consciousness, the very thing that allows you to watch this video, and much more importantly, to live and appreciate life, that fire was first lit by a spark somewhere here. The exact time the first members of our species emerged is the subject of significant debate, although more recent estimates generally fall around the 500,000 year ago mark. Of course, our emergence was by no means instantaneous. It's not like a fully anatomically and behaviorally modern human just sprang into existence one day. Rather, it was a gradual process, which continued for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. The exact location of our emergence is even more difficult to pinpoint. Despite decades of study across Africa, the smoking gun, which could offer a clear location, has continued to elude scientists. Both Eastern as well as Southern Africa present compelling cases as the cradle of our species, but there is also a theory which rejects the notion of a single discernible location. Many of the fossils found across the continent exhibit significant differences to specimens that are similarly old. However, as time progresses, the differences between specimens grow less extreme, suggesting that initially disparate populations may have merged over time to form the anatomically modern humans we know today. Wherever our origin within Africa, our dispersal across the continent was rapid. The oldest known fossils to be classified as members of Homo sapiens were discovered here in Morocco, and are estimated to be roughly 315,000 years old. Fossils were also found here in South Africa, and here in Ethiopia, which are estimated to be roughly 260,000 and 230,000 years old respectively. As we continue to move on the timeline, we find Homo sapiens specimens in ever greater numbers across the continent, with more fossils being found in modern-day Ethiopia, Tanzania, South Africa, and Kenya. It's also possible that sapiens were present in other locations across the continent. However, finding them is another matter. Physically inhospitable and isolated locations, poor climatic conditions for long-term preservation of specimens, and political instability in areas of interest all make finding specimens for study, an already hugely difficult task, nearly impossible. Homo sapiens populations also spread here into the Levant. Although the populations which arrived here as early as 185,000 years ago were likely the first of our species to move out of Africa, all evidence suggests that they did not continue to spread beyond the Middle East. Instead, these early migrants likely either died out or retreated back into Africa. Thus, about 70,000 years before present, population spread of Homo sapiens looked roughly something like this. Although our species had been confined to the African continent since birth, we now stood on the cusp of our greatest ever journey. The first stop on that journey, out of areas that have been our homes for tens of thousands of years and into the unknown, was likely India. Whether migrants moved through the Levant or across what is referred to as the southern route, India being the first destination makes a lot of sense. While Europe and Central Asia were largely frigid tundra 70,000 years ago, India offered a much more hospitable and familiar climate to the Homo sapiens fresh out of Africa. Unfortunately, relevant archaeological sites in India are few and far between. Although the site here at Jawalapuram contains a number of relatively sophisticated stone tools, no fossils were found, and as such, the tools can't be definitively attributed to Homo sapiens. They could, for example, have been created by the Denisovans, an enigmatic human species descended from Homo erectus, known to have been present across much of Asia. The most compelling evidence for movement into India around the 70 to 60,000 year mark lies not in the fossils found there, but rather in the evidence found beyond it. This cave in modern-day Laos contained fossils which indicate that Homo sapiens had spread to this location by about 50 to 60,000 years ago. It's also in this area where we certainly came into contact with our evolutionary cousins, the Denisovans. Although we have only a few sites with definitive evidence of Denisovan occupation, the geographic spread of these sites indicates that they inhabited much of East and Southeast Asia. This is also backed up by genetic evidence. We know that our ancestors who moved into this area interbred with the already present species. Nowadays, populations from this part of the world derive on average 2 to 6% of their genome from the Denisovans. The genetic record also suggests that these may have spread as far south as the Philippines, Indonesia, and potentially even Papua New Guinea. as modern populations there have particularly high traces of Denisovan DNA. Nor were they the only other human species present in these areas. It seems that the, at this point extinct, Homo erectus had spread not just across Asia, but also deep into maritime Southeast Asia. A number of erectus's offspring species have been found across this region, such as on the Philippine island of Luzon and the Indonesian island of Flores. However, the presence of this diverse range of evolutionary relatives likely did little to slow down advancing Homo sapiens. By 50,000 years ago, he stood ready to make a giant leap. Although other human species had also developed seafaring abilities, none had ever demonstrated conclusive evidence for being able to cross a distance like the one between the paleocontinents of Sunda and Sahul. As evidenced by sites found across Australia, the historic achievement of traversing such a distance and being the first to visit the land down under almost certainly belonged to Homo sapiens. The Devil's Lair cave in Western Australia contains stone tools and fossils dating back to 48,000 years before the present, and the specimens found at Lake Mungo suggest that sapiens had not only occupied this area as early as 50,000 years ago, but also that they engaged in sophisticated burial practices such as ritual cremation, the earliest recorded instance of this anywhere in the world. Around the same time the Mungo specimens were laid to rest, Homo sapiens were likely spreading into China. The Tianyuan man, discovered near what is today Beijing, is estimated to be about 40,000 years old. It's likely that migrations into modern-day Okinawa soon followed, as evidenced by human remains found in Yamashita Cave, dating back 32,000 years. Settlement of the Japanese home islands was likely also achieved around this time, after populations originating in Northeast Asia left the mainland, traveling either by sea or across to land bridges present at the time. Beginning approximately 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens started adapting to survive on the inhospitable tundra steppe, a biome which had previously been too cold for our species, and as such remained in the possession of our evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals, for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo sapiens populations from the Middle East and South Asia first began their northward journey by pushing into Turkey, the Balkans, and eventually the rest of Europe. Sites in Bulgaria and Italy indicate habitation by Homo sapiens about 44,000 years before present, and these two sites, one here in Russia and another here in Germany, show evidence for human habitation dating back 40,000 years, including, most intriguingly, these miniature statues, generally referred to as Venus figurines. We can only speculate as to the exact symbolism of this art, but their intricate design is clear evidence of not only intelligence, but something more: creativity. Approximately 200 Venus carvings and countless other types of statues have been discovered throughout Europe, and these figures are only one small example of the treasure trove of creative expression that we have found across Europe and the rest of the world. Paleolithic humans evidently placed great value on art and its symbolic potential. They adorned themselves with jewelry and makeup, illustrated cave paintings, produced instruments and music, and as evidenced by numerous elaborate burial sites, showed great respect and care for their dead. All throughout our rapid expansion across Europe, which placed us as far north as Wales and as far west as the Pyrenees by about 30,000 years ago, we likely had frequent interactions with the Neanderthal populations already living there. At times, these interactions would have been violent and competitive in nature, but we also know that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had much more, shall we say, productive encounters as well. There is strong evidence of interbreeding with Neanderthal populations in our genetic code. Nowadays, European populations have an average of between 1 and 8% share of Neanderthal DNA. However, the archaeological record shows that as Homo sapiens moved across the continent, evidence for Neanderthal occupation in the form of fossils as well as tool technology associated with them, begins to disappear, instead to be replaced by the more sophisticated tools and the less robust skeletons associated only with Homo sapiens. By 35,000 years ago, evidence for the continued existence of Neanderthals across the continent is running dry. The last bastion of Neanderthal habitation is likely on the Iberian Peninsula, and even this does not last for long. The last shaky piece of evidence indicating Neanderthal life is found here in Gibraltar, the last corner of Europe to be reached by our ancestors. While we cannot be certain of the exact causes of the Neanderthals' demise, Homo sapiens undoubtedly played a role. Maybe our ancestors were just able to outcompete Neanderthals, both in direct competition as well as indirect competition over the likes of food sources. Additionally, a number of changes to the climate in the period directly preceding the Neanderthals' extinction likely also played a significant role. These shifts may have caused significant depopulation events in areas inhabited by Neanderthals, areas which were then instead rapidly filled by encroaching Homo sapiens. Finally, Neanderthals' demographic and genetic weaknesses likely made them more susceptible to diseases and inflexible in the face of other arising challenges. A relatively small population, an estimated maximum of 70,000 individuals, spread thinly across Europe and Central Asia, placed the Neanderthal species in a precarious position. The small population size likely not only hampered the species' ability to repopulate following a period of increased adversity, but may have also caused inbreeding within isolated populations. This in turn likely spawned a number of genetic defects, which may have compounded over time, thereby exacerbating existing issues by reducing fertility and compromising survival abilities among already vulnerable populations. Whatever the exact combination of causes for the Neanderthals' demise, it's clear that, although they had previously been able to respond to challenges with flexibility and tenacity, they were seemingly unable to do so upon the introduction of Homo sapiens into the equation. Although information on the life and eventual extinction of Neanderthals' evolutionary siblings, the Denisovans, remains scarce, it's possible that their demise was similarly accelerated by their interactions with Homo sapiens. As humans moved into areas already inhabited by Denisovan populations across East Asia, these were likely either displaced, killed, or subsumed into the wider Homo sapiens population. Although some disputed evidence exists suggesting that Denisovans may have survived in modern-day Indonesia up to about 15,000 years ago, it's more likely that they suffered the same fate as the other human species in the area upon coming into contact and competition with Homo sapiens about 50,000 years ago. The last convincing physical piece of evidence we have of Denisovan existence is 40,000 years old and was found here in the northern reaches of the Altai Mountains in Russia. As time progressed, Homo sapiens continued expanding further north and east into the vast expanse of Siberia. Populations from Eastern Europe moving across the Great Russian Plain and the Ural Mountains were joined by groups moving through Central and Eastern Asia. Both genetic and physical evidence suggests that humans had reached Beringia by about 20,000 years ago. Within approximately 50,000 years, Homo sapiens had gone from confinement in Africa to establishing a lasting presence in every corner of the Old World. And then Homo sapiens went a step further and achieved a feat that would not be replicated for another 18,500 years. They crossed from the Old World into the New. By traversing the Beringia land bridge and arriving in Alaska, they set in motion the colonization of an entire hemisphere previously untouched by humans, let alone Homo sapiens. But for the first few thousand years or so, these early explorers and their descendants were confined to Alaska. Keep in mind that at this stage in our planet's history, we're in the middle of an ice age, with average global temperatures being 6 degrees Celsius lower than today. Hence the existence of these gigantic, impassable ice sheets over much of northern Europe and Canada. It's only when these ice sheets begin to retreat from their maximum extent around 18,000 years ago that these two corridors for movement down into the rest of the continent appear. Flowing through these corridors, our ancestors' expansion into the Americas was extraordinarily rapid. The earliest evidence for habitation in North America is found here in Pennsylvania. Tools, pottery, and organic remains of plants and animals were found here and dated to be 16,000 years old. Other notable finds include the Arlington Springs man, found here in California, who, if dated correctly at 13,000 years old, may represent the oldest known human remains in the New World. Artifacts found here in New Mexico, which serve as the type identifier for the Clovis culture, generally associated with the production of these sophisticated tools made of stone and bone. And the Little Salt Springs and Windover burial sites in Florida, each containing hundreds of exceptionally well-preserved bodies, including dozens dating back as early as 7,000 years before present, which still contain brain matter. Astoundingly, the earliest evidence for a human presence in South America was found here in Chile. The small camp found here, containing evidence of a tent-like structure, numerous stone tools, and an assortment of various foods, including nuts, berries, and even a specimen of wild potato, indicated after being dated that human populations lived here as early as about 14,500 years ago. The existence of a site of this age in a location so far south lends credence to the Pacific coastal route, and particularly the marine migration hypotheses. The two suggest that rather than traveling between Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets, the earliest waves of explorers traveled around the Cordilleran ice sheet and along the Pacific coast, with the marine migration theory going so far as to suggest that they did so primarily by sea. Indeed, considering that, as of now, no physical evidence dating between the opening of the corridors and the settlement of Monteverde exists anywhere between the two locations, a coastal or even a maritime route has become a feasible and even popular theory among archaeologists and anthropologists. With numerous other sites across South America being dated to similar ages as sites in North America, it's possible that rather than occurring one after the other, exploration and settlement of the two continents may instead have taken place more or less simultaneously. The site here in Brazil presents evidence for a human presence approximately 12,000 years ago. This includes various dietary remains, numerous tools including fishhooks, and best of all, art. If you ever need evidence that these were definitely humans, and also that we as a species never change, well, here it is. Finally, this site here in Chile, close to the southernmost point of South America, and filled with literally hundreds of tools, offers evidence for human occupation of this final frontier of the New World beginning as early as 11,000 years ago. Homo sapiens had become a truly global species. At this stage, taking a look at our map, it seems as though Homo sapiens has conquered all there is to conquer. However, one final frontier remains so remote, so obstinately unreachable, that it would not be fully settled for another 9,000 years. I am, of course, talking about the disparate islands of the Pacific, mere specks of land in the midst of a violent and unending ocean. Astonishingly, the exploration and settlement of this region was accomplished using what we today would consider to be primitive technology. No GPS, no modern shipbuilding, not even a compass aided the intrepid explorers who pushed into these unknown waters. Their only means of navigation, the currents and the stars. Their only means of propulsion, the wind. When the ancestors of those who would go on to settle as far as New Zealand, Hawaii, and Madagascar set out from here in Taiwan 4,000 years ago, they could have likely never anticipated the enormity of the journey their people, the Austronesians as they have since been called, were embarking on. Even their first voyages across the Luzon Strait were daunting and impressive endeavors considering the tools at their disposal. And yet, having arrived in the Philippines, the Austronesians did not rest on their laurels. instead pushing further south into the Philippines and Indonesia, all the while intermingling with the descendants of that early wave of human migration that had moved from Asia into Australia. Simultaneously, sailors also expanded into the previously undiscovered region of Micronesia. By 3,200 years ago, waves of explorers had also reached the Solomon Islands, soon followed by the rest of Melanesia and most of western Polynesia by approximately 2,900 years ago. For centuries, this remained the furthest extent of human presence in the Pacific, until about 1,300 years ago, when expansion resumed, following the discovery and settlement of what are today the Cook Islands and French Polynesia. Hawaii was found 200 years later, followed by Easter Island about 1,000 years ago, and finally New Zealand 800 years ago. Amazingly, the Austronesians originating in Taiwan didn't limit their already prodigious exploration to Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Both linguistic and genetic evidence strongly suggest that they also spread across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as the Comoros Islands and Madagascar. Even more unbelievably, recent studies have also suggested that they may have reached as far as South America, where they likely traded and interbred with the present populations. Yes, in a matter of a few thousand years, explorers hoping to escape the effects of overpopulation in Taiwan had not only managed to settle lands capable of sustaining them, but had, whether intentionally or unintentionally, created a cultural quasi-empire spanning half the globe. Thanks to these intrepid sailors, Homo sapiens now ruled over both land and sea. There was nothing save a few remote islands and the barren wastes of the North and South Poles left to explore. From being an embryonic species threatened by extinction in a dusty corner of Africa, we had grown into this planet's dominant species. But why did our ancestors leave Africa behind and migrate into new and unknown areas to begin with? What drove them to leave behind comfort in place of hardship, the familiar in place of the unknown? That's sort of the big question in all of this, at least for me, but it's also the most difficult. To help shine at least a little bit of light on it, consider this. Why do you explore? I mean, look, I get it. It's pretty unlikely that you get the chance to explore previously untouched continents all that much. The types of journeys undertaken by our early ancestors may seem out of reach, and it may seem like exploration is an extinct phenomenon for most people these days. But even if you don't think you do, you definitely explore. Whether it's going on a hike in the mountains, or traversing the dense streets of a foreign city while on vacation, or something as seemingly mundane as looking for a new coffee shop. You explore. And by the way, none of this is to mention the exploration we do in science or academia. It may be taking place in labs or libraries. We may be looking for a fact rather than a food source, but it's still a form of exploration. Yes, our contexts are different. The things that we and our ancestors explore are different. But the urge to explore is seemingly a common trait embedded deep within us, regardless of whether we're alive today or we're one of the first members of our species. If there's one thing I hope this video achieves, it's that beyond just informing you, it also sparks your curiosity. Whether that curiosity, that passion, is for this specific topic or something totally different, what matters is that you act on that curiosity. Because the spirit of exploration, that same indomitable spirit of exploration which drove our ancestors to push into the dense jungles of South Asia, or the frozen wastes of Beringia, or the unending waves of the Pacific, that spirit resides within each of us. Do our ancestors justice. Make them proud. Go out there and explore.